Hello, everybody. So on our Canvas page, we have an assignment to go over this reading over Washington taking office and then the birth of political parties. And so what you're going to do is you're going to read through this, and as you read through, there are questions in the margins. And so you see here like a checkpoint question. There's more checkpoints over here. You're going to fill in those checkpoints, but there are also questions throughout the reading, and so you're going to answer those as well. So if you want to listen along, you're more than welcome to do that now. So I'm going to start here. Section 1, Washington organized the executive branch, and Hamilton worked to end the nation's financial crisis. The Whiskey Rebellion tested the new government. And so that's what this first little section is going to cover. The first president, George Washington, set many precedents. Precedents was one of our vocabulary terms, or examples as the first president. He created new federal departments. Alexander Hamilton led the Treasury. Thomas Jefferson led the State Department. Henry Knox was Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph was Attorney General. The group was called the Cabinet. The Judiciary Act of 1789 created a federal court system led by the Supreme Court. And so over here, our first checkpoint is to list the members of the President Washington's cabinet. And so we've already answered that question. So if you want to pause here, fill it out, you can do that. Okay, so moving on, the nation's first economic crisis. The American Revolution left the nation in debt. The debt was mostly in bonds. A bond is a certificate issued by a government for an amount of money that the government promises to pay back with interest. Speculators, or people who invest in a risky venture in the hope of making a large profit, bought bonds for less than they were worth. Many believed it was unfair to pay spectators in full. So another checkpoint we have here is after the American Revolution, the nation's debt was mostly in what form? Go ahead and answer that now, and then move on to the next paragraph. So now we have Hamilton's financial plan. Hamilton developed a plan to solve the country's financial crisis. The first part of the plan was for the government to pay back all federal and state debts. Most southern states did not want the federal government to pay state debts because they had already paid theirs on their own. Eventually, the South agreed to this part of the plan. In return, the government agreed to build its capital in the South. That's how we get Washington, D.C. as our capital. The second part of Hamilton's plan was to charter a national bank. Jefferson argued that a national bank was unconstitutional, contrary to what is permitted by the Constitution. He called for a strict interpretation or reading of the Constitution. Hamilton, on the other hand, called for a loose interpretation. He believed that the Constitution gave Congress the power to do things not directly allowed. And so a national bank was created, but interpretation of the Constitution still provokes disagreement today. Southerners also opposed Hamilton's idea for a national tariff, or a tax on imported goods. The tariff raised federal funds and also protected United States manufacturers. This helped northern industries because it protected them from lower-priced foreign goods. Since Southerners had little industry, the tariff hurt them by raising prices. Congress did not pass the tariff. And so we have another checkpoint here. Name the two types of constitutional interpretation used during the debate about the national bank. And so those would be Jefferson's interpretation and Hamilton's. How did they interpret the Constitution? Can go ahead and answer that now and then move on to the next paragraph. The Whiskey Rebellion. Congress put a tax on all whiskey made and sold in the country. Some Pennsylvania farmers who were against the tax started a violent protest. Washington sent federal troops to Pennsylvania, showing that armed rebellion would not be accepted. And so we have our checkpoint question, what caused the Whiskey Rebellion? And then you have your two check for progress questions. for the end of this section 1. What 2 crises occurred during the early part of President George Washington's administration? And what were the 3 parts to Hamilton's financial plan? So we're going to go ahead and get started with section 2 now. The framers did not expect political parties to develop, but differences over issues led to the creation of parties. After the 1796 election, tensions increased between the parties. So we're going to go ahead and get started with political parties emerge. The framers of the Constitution did not expect political parties to develop in the United States. Instead, they thought that government leaders would work together for the sake of the whole nation. In those days, people spoke of factions rather than political parties. A faction was an organized political group, and the word was not complimentary. James Madison thought factions were selfish groups that ignored the well-being of the whole nation. President Washington tried to discourage the growth of factions, but by the early 1790s, they began to form anyway. So the framers didn't really want political groups to form. They wanted everybody to work cohesively as a group, but obviously that's very difficult to do as there are differing opinions on different matters. And so the checkpoint question asks, name the term that people use instead of the term political parties. All right, Republicans against Federalists. The 2 parties that formed were the Republicans and the Federalists. The Republicans developed out of Democratic Republican clubs that accused the federal government of growing too strong. They wanted to keep most power at the state or local level. The Federalists took their name from the people who had supported the adoption of the Constitution, and they believed the United States needed a strong federal government to hold the country together. At the time that both parties were organizing, the Federalists had an advantage. President Washington usually supported Alexander Hamilton and his policies. Thomas Jefferson resigned as Secretary of State because of the federal government's support of Federalist policies. And so Thomas Jefferson was a Republican. He was a Democratic Republican, became a Republican. So you start to see, this is really where we start to see the formation of the 2 political parties. Jefferson resigns as Secretary of State because he doesn't agree with the policies that Alexander Hamilton was pushing and that President Washington was supporting. So we have a little chart here of Republicans and Federalists. The main supporters of the Republicans were Southern planters and Northern artisans and farmers. The main leaders were Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They supported a strong government. They opposed a national bank. They opposed a tariff on imported goods. They supported France because it had recently overthrown its king, and they strictly interpreted the Constitution. Whereas the Federalists' main supporters were merchants, other property owners, and workers in trade and manufacturing. Their main leader is Alexander Hamilton. They supported a strong national government. They supported a national bank. They supported a tariff on imported goods. They were pro-British, actually, and they loosely interpreted the Constitution. And so we have a checkpoint question here as well. List the main supporters of the Republicans and Federalists. All right, the election of 1796. In 1796, George Washington announced that he would not run for a 3rd term as president. His action set an important precedent. Not until Franklin Roosevelt ran for and won a 3rd term in 1940 would any president seek more than 2 terms. In 1951, the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution limited presidents to 2 terms. So George Washington sets that example right from the beginning that he's only going to serve for 2 terms, and for the most part, most presidents follow that until Franklin Roosevelt won his 3rd term in 1940. Today, the president and vice president run together on the same ticket. However, at the time of the 1796 election, the president and the vice president were not elected as a ticket. The candidate with the most votes became president. The candidate who came in second place was elected vice president. In 1796, a Federalist, John Adams, became president, but the Republican candidate, Thomas Jefferson, became vice president. And this led to serious tensions during the next 4 years. So Adams' presidency with Jefferson as his vice president was a very tense time. All right, checkpoint question asks you to name the person elected president in 1796. And we have the section questions. Check your progress. Why did the framers of the Constitution not expect political parties? What were the two political parties' positions on power of the national government? Okay, so that is all you're going to be covering for this assignment. Make sure that you watch the other videos posted as well, and I will see you all soon.